Welcome, Pam. Pam is our second speaker today. Pam is and I'm going to literally call it out, Mexican-born Vancouverite. I know you love this part of your culture and expressing that, and I think it's really great. Yeah. So I'm going to call it out just because I know you had it in your bio. Nice. But you're definitely here in Vancouver, where I am as well, which is great. You've got about 10 years experience in product. You've had a really diverse career. She's worked in telecom, TELUS, live entertainment at Ticketmaster, various media and IoT startups, and an omni-channel e-commerce. Pam is a champion of initiatives to remove systemic barriers in product and an active mentor aiming to demystify our field for non-tech types as well. So welcome, Pam. Really great to see you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. First thing, I'm so grateful that Lucinda was up first, and I'm so glad that we're very aligned, because everything she was saying, I was just nodding along like, yep, absolutely. So no major conflicting content, I imagine, which is great, but also kind of, it just goes to show we're all trying. And at the same time, it's not an easy realm to be in. Technology is seemingly straightforward when you're a user and things work well. But obviously, we've all been privy to tech challenges like we just did right now. It's like all of these integrations should work hand in hand. And yet at some point, something's not quite right. And that's why you need a wonderful product team, and really not just the product team, but everyone in the organization needs to be on board and aligned and understanding what we're trying to do and why, as opposed to everyone trying to operate in their own silo, reaching their own KPIs, because at the end of the day, that's not going to be what the ideal user experience is. So onwards and upwards, we can get going with the next slide, please, Scott. Beautiful. So again, he already covered the intro in breadth and depth, which I really appreciate. What I did want to just reiterate is that I've worked in both giant organizations with thousands of people, as well as one where I was the first full-time employee as like person number 8. And so as a result, because I've worked in both Vancouver and London, UK, and I've worked in truly distributed remote teams, as well as those where it's all hands on deck in a tiny little WeWork, rented boardroom, I've really enjoyed the luxury as well as the challenges that come with that just crazy amount of differences with processes, tools, attitudes, risk aversion, all that good stuff. Perfect timing. This is what sometimes product can feel like. I think we've all been there, where there's just a million whiteboards and tools and ideas and excitement, which is all fantastic. But then it starts to feel like, okay, so is opportunity going to kill us? Is it death by 1,000 paper cuts? Because there's just so much to do. How can we actually ensure that we supercharge the product team in whatever way we can, so that we stay human and that we can actually achieve stuff instead of just continue to have boards and roadmaps and other such things. Do you mind going forward one more? That's fine. Cheers. So I just did a quick recap slide. We can just click through twice more. These will be the key takeaways of today. I really wanted to just front load. If nothing else, these are the key things that I'd love folks to take away. And it's very much do as I say, not as I do. I'm sure in many times in my career, I've not actually stuck to doing these things adequately and instead gotten overexcited and over skewed on any one direction. But I did want to just reiterate, first things first, there's a big difference between the ambitious excitement of product roadmap versus the realities and the intricacies, perhaps for those of us that have worked in tiny startups trying to scale, or vice versa, giant organizations with decades of code and legacy systems and legacy thinking, perhaps, and how important it truly is to just partner on both technical debt as well as UX debt and anything else that might be kind of like lingering behind the scenes that ends up impacting our users. And typically these are lagging indicators. It's really rare that a user will reach out and say, I've noticed your latency is like ever so slightly increasing each time I log in. That's probably not going to surface in any one metric. Instead, it'll be a giant amalgamation of Datadog dashboards, or just a kind of a heuristics of understanding things aren't quite as clean and simple as they used to be with X journey or this type of feature on this device. But truly, if you're actually focusing on your users' needs as opposed to just what we each individually are monitoring, those things should bubble to the surface, hopefully. Ideally, always thinking about the long-term implications of our decisions. So it's not just how do we clean house, it's how do we ensure that with every new feature, with every new iteration, we're thinking ahead to what might happen when we go from 100 to 1,000 to 1,000,000 to 10 million users. And we all get caught up in our own immediacy and the sense of urgency, the excitement, or the need to hit a certain KPI to reach like a investment milestone, for example. But it's really, really key, as we all know, to constantly just zoom out and really think about the big picture of what our users are perceiving. Number two will be all about like the operational, like how do we actually do that? Because it's all well and good to say, let's align and let's fix the thing before it even happens. But how do we actually set up a framework to enable all of us together rather than the product person in the room hoping and praying that at some point they'll be heard to fix something or to address an issue? Let's really make sure that we're all hands on deck and understanding the actual gravity of the situation as opposed to just scores and a relative sense of what's going on. And lastly, being Kaizen, but to a degree. So as always, we all love to constantly improve on an experience or a way in which a user is actually engaging with our product or service technology. As often as possible, data informed, but not necessarily data driven, and also being really, really open to cross-departmental inputs. I'll fess up, this is a mistake I've made before of the data says this, let's go in this direction. But what if your business development or sales teams are saying, well, actually, the market's starting to feel like this is the new direction we should be going, or all of our competitors are veering very strongly in this course. How confident are we that our decisions or the ways that we had set things up a year or two ago are in fact still relevant, given, for example, a looming recession, or even in a less recent way, hey, there's a pandemic. Half of the features that we might have thought about releasing that were very much dependent on in-person interaction, suddenly not relevant. So even though the data says this, the reality is as such, how can we constantly ensure that we are bringing those worlds together? So those are the takeaways. I'll dive a little bit deeper on the next slide. So I think this might just be a quick recap, which lots of animations. So Scott, feel free to just click through maybe 7 times. You already gave the breadth of my career, but what I did want to just showcase is it's been a really quirky journey for me because I started at TELUS, which is a Canadian telco, very established. Most of our users were either existing customers or prospective, very e-commerce focus of you're either already an internet or TV subscriber, or you're hopefully going to be. And so every decision we made was, is it acquisition or retention? What messaging are we putting forth in which type of experience and why? How much can we ensure that as a giant organization that deals with the millions of users, we don't have engagement with customer service. We don't have people needing to go to the store to get their issue resolved. So let's really drive self-serve and endless adoption of digital technologies and so on. Ticketmaster, of course, we all, some of us remember having to go and buy a ticket, whereas now it's almost, I think, impossible to try to do so, versus, unfortunately, some of the pressures that come with incredibly high demand events where the issue isn't demand, it's meeting that demand. People want to get access to those tickets. How do we ensure the right legitimate user that is a true fan of an event will get to go? That were a lot of the challenges for us. Is it wasn't so much, let's get people through the door, is how do we get the right people through the right door at the right time? And then I'll skip over a little bit the ones in the middle, but those were either my London journeys or at Essence, I was working remotely and they're based in Montreal. The entire team became distributed during the pandemic, and that led to a lot of challenges because working in the luxury fashion e-commerce space with an organization that had never had to be distributed before, they used to all be going into the Montreal office at least 4 days a week, led to, as you can imagine, a lot of misalignment, a lot of siloed decision-making, and various ways in which technology started to feel a bit fragmented as opposed to everyone truly being on the same page. It's one thing to adapt and adopt new processes and tools. It's another to truly have the same decision-making framework apply, especially when it came to technical debt. There were several systems in the e-commerce space similar to Ticketmaster to deal with really high demand, what they're called like drops. So let's say 100 pairs of a super limited edition sneaker. Well, that's going to come with a lot of challenges and a lot of friction that if we as a product team don't address head on from the get-go are actually going to cause a really horrid user experience. So I learned a lot from there, a little bit more on that later. But lastly, my most recent chapter was at Penny. And that's kind of a quirky one to discuss because it's almost like half CRM, half content management, and a plethora of other tools for direct salespeople. So these are people that are already selling products for other organizations, and Penny is kind of like the ability for them to supercharge their results. There's a lot of task management, time management, nudges for people to do certain actions today versus a month from now based on AI predictions of what will be the right thing to do today to give you the most bang for your buck if you only have, let's say, 2 hours to work on building your business as a side hustle. So there's a lot of implications for product that every decision felt like, well, is this truly the thing we should be focusing on, or are other features most important? So all of that said, if we proceed, that hopefully provides some color for some of my rambles today. So again, first thing, we really, really need to ensure we're focusing on users' needs, because it's so easy to get caught up on what we might think are phenomenal ideas for features, or what one particular client is really pushing for, perhaps what one particular solution architect is saying, this is the thing that is, it's killing us. Like if only we could spend 6 months completely refactoring the way that we currently handle these types of service calls. 6 months is a while. Most of our organizations that have the luxury of doing that, unless it's truly like, this is it. This is the one thing we need to fix. So if we go on to the next slide, this is some of the stuff that in my most recent 2 roles, I've unfortunately now had to just dive right into without any expertise whatsoever, because I do not have a technical background. I kind of pride myself on not having one, because I get to be the non-technical person in the room asking, what does this even mean? What are we doing here? But when it comes to having to bring in complex technologies, unfortunately, it does feel like sometimes I'm at a disadvantage, because it's tough to answer questions, let alone even ask questions. There are certain product meetings where it just starts to become technical. It starts to feel like this is a technical roadmap with a bunch of implications, lots of jargon, lots of metrics. And it sometimes is a privilege, I would say, as the non-technical person to say, okay, like, great, 3-hour workshop, super detailed, fantastic. What are we actually trying to do here? And not sound in any way like, holier than thou, but it does feel like sometimes we can get so easily in the weeds of the must-dos and the next steps, as opposed to what does this mean for users? At the end of the day, could a really lo-fi solution fit the need and maybe just well enough for us to start to measure and understand what we're doing? Do we really need an unbelievably complex recommendation engine that takes into account market segmentation and a bunch of other parameters and months of technical development time, versus us truly understanding the basics? Then again, I, of course, want to play devil's advocate to myself. Sometimes it is like, this could be the most incredible way to completely overhaul the user experience and to really nail at a personalized level, contextual and all of the buzzwords all at once. What is it we're trying to do and why? But it's actually just us constantly having that, I would say, healthy discourse and appetite for debate. And that's where it gets tough, because not all organizations have the culture for that. There are certain organizations that absolutely foster and really embrace our ability to come together and have completely disparate viewpoints and challenge each other. And unfortunately, as I'm sure we've all been privy to, there are others where it's decisions have been made. This is very top down, as Lucinda alluded to, with all of the various animals that can be at play in different organizations. Sometimes a hippo just decides, we're building a recommendation engine, let's move on. It's not up for discussion. And so with that, there are certain challenges that, of course, we have to just kind of curtail, but we can still constantly try to influence and surface as the non-technical, or perhaps just the less technical, for some that might be. How can we truly understand, especially in a cross-device or multi-device experience where someone might be at times engaging on their desktop when like bored in a work meeting, but then oftentimes trying to actually convert on their device, or vice versa? How can we actually know that what we're doing matters, that all of this time and energy being spent on these super complex systems is in fact helping a user meet their need, and not just overcomplicating it, and sometimes for our own justifications? Next slide, please. So this is where I feel like product has the superpower, right? Realistically, there's no ChatGPT product managers yet, and there probably won't ever be, because we're supposed to be the ones at the table to really represent all of the different pieces of a user experience. We're the ones that can really try to galvanize what is happening on the customer support side of things. What are people reaching out to us about? Separately, what are they not reaching out about and simply dropping off? What are we seeing in the funnels? What are we seeing in click maps and various other ways for us to understand, why is there a particular friction with something that should otherwise be really straightforward in our experience, or vice versa? If something's going incredibly well, what can we learn from that? How can we replicate that in other aspects of our experiences? And also blind spots such as accessibility, usability, ways in which we might be over-indexing or course correcting a bit too much in one direction and maybe being overly aesthetically pleasing and like really sleek and wonderful. But is that actually causing a really inaccessible experience for some folks? And how can we constantly be the ones to champion based on our product vision and based on what we're supposed to be aiming towards? Where are we going and how can we ensure that we're not just decision-making robots, but truly a holistic team overall? So we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so lots of words, apologies. But basically, I'd love to just really deep dive into some of the stuff that we end up forgetting about. I know once I've joined an organization and I feel like I understand our user base, we start to then just use certain sentences as generalizations. But often we might start to lose sight of, well, yes, our users primarily are X, Y, Z or Z, but what are the key differences that we need to constantly keep in mind? So are there age gaps or discrepancies? Are we accidentally being ageist in any one direction? Language. You might notice once in a while I sound a little bit funny because I did spend some time in the UK, so sometimes I'll have like a slight accent or I'll use words that might not necessarily be normal in a North American context. I catch myself, but that is something technology can't do. So if we've had a patchwork of experiences when you start to go from a really localized product to a more global offering, sometimes stuff gets lost in translation and there might be cultural differences or nuances, like in some countries using an exclamation mark is excitement, in others it's aggression. How can you constantly, as the product person in the room, ensure that that kind of attitude towards really questioning and being discerning of decision making permeates across beyond just your small sphere of influence? How can you as product ensure that everyone is constantly thinking, oh, hang on a minute, maybe this isn't the best approach? Or can we ensure that our content team, if you have the luxury of having one, can maybe take another pass at refining what we're doing in, for example, our call to action button copy? Is it straightforward? Is it too blunt? Is it too casual? Are people truly understanding what we're doing at any aspect of the experience or not? I've touched on this before, but of course, the when and the where someone is engaging, including if it's like not the best internet connection, not the newest device or cross device. What are all of the nuances of an experience that may or may not be actually hindering the product experience, as opposed to those of us that tend to engage with our product in a very optimal setting where, especially now with work from home that's been like set up and good to go, we might be going through a funnel and constantly assume, I don't understand what the problem is, everything's fine. But until you truly have, for example, robust device lab or various other ways to really try to replicate experiences and empower your entire organization to do the same, typically there might start to be user needs being left behind. Lots of other stuff I could get into, but from a time check standpoint, I think I'll just move on to the blue stuff at the bottom there. I personally would love to ensure that we focus on being a utility instead of a novelty. I say that because in one of the startups I worked at in the UK, it was like a cool new idea. It was quirky, it was fun, young people were really into it. It was essentially renting a power bank using IoT technology with your phone. So it was really straightforward so that you could ensure that unless your phone had died, that you'd be able to keep it going. But the approach that they had taken was very much, let's just do it and prove product market fit and then just like, let's ramp up and keep going, as opposed to really focusing on the reliability of the service, the connectivity of all of the systems that needed to work incredibly well for the user experience to happen seamlessly and quickly. When we were given the opportunity to be a part of a perk from a telco organization that was going to add us as kind of a loyalty thing of like free rentals with this service, that became so palpably obvious that this thing needs to work incredibly well, or that organization's customer support team is going to be getting the complaints of, I tried renting this thing, it didn't work, what's going on? We knew we had to grow up. So we really did a full-fledged refactor based on what our developers had said, as well as a really strategic undertaking for us of, this isn't just for now, it's for later. For example, how can we now tap into entirely new markets and really go global with this thing? How can we ensure that we're not just catering to iPhones? Because it was a very, very conscientious decision from the start, both for UX and the tech decisions that had been made a year prior to when I joined, that it was a very specific experience to iOS. Of course, if you want to go global, that certainly was not the way to go. So we knew it was the right moment to make those decisions happen. And it was a tough decision to make, of course, because no one wants to hear, hang on, we need to pause and have no more new features, no more bells and whistles for a while. Because at this point, this isn't optional, it's mandatory. Like users will need to proceed with this, this, and this. We can no longer continue to just put band-aids on this systems and solution. We actually need to fix it. And so most importantly, as I alluded to earlier, what are the solution architects or tech leads or CTO or whoever is in charge of making those decisions at your organization? What are they craving? What would they love to have and are so passionate about? And perhaps more importantly at times, what do they fear? What is keeping them up at night? What is making them really apprehensive to go on vacation or to just take a full, weekend off the grid, not constantly checking their devices? Are they concerned that the loads are not being properly balanced anymore? Are they concerned that we have made certain decisions that are putting unnecessary pressure on systems, and that as product people, we can typically, to a degree, kind of shrug it off and say, okay, well, let me know when it's broken. Let's not get to that. Let's actually really try to partner on what users' needs are and how we as an organization can sustain them long-term. Moving on to next slide, please. So of course, we all laugh at these things, and surely there's lots of meetings that are not well structured, don't have a clear objective, agenda, outcomes, follow-up, etc. But there's a certain amount of, it just comes with the territory in our role that we sometimes do need to be everywhere all the time, always. I don't love to say that, but I do think it's a privilege that we're one of those key roles that does get to constantly understand marketing is about to launch a massive campaign. It's going to drive a ton of traffic. Has anyone thought about the implications? Because meanwhile, tech teams are over here building something entirely different without a sense of what's going on. How can we bridge that gap? How can we preempt some of the pressure that might be coming down so that we are constantly the meteorologists instead of just the ones on the receiving end of something's broken or something's not quite right? So now we can move on. So this is where it gets a bit interesting, right? We are kind of this nucleus across the entire organization, and we should be. And I know sometimes product gets discussed a bit in like a silo, or perhaps even disparagingly as like, those people have a roadmap already and they're doing stuff and they're not listening to us. That might be true. So we need to be much more empathetic to all of the needs across the organization, and how can we ensure that we actually leverage them and bring them on board for them to feel like they're part of the product team and not vice versa. Next slide, please. Let's move on. We've all felt this, we feel it all the time. So with our next speaking point, this is where I think it gets really interesting. So if we move on to the next slide. Here is where I think I've been quite lucky in my career to have some really phenomenal partners that are able to distill and kind of dumb down some of the technical implications of what's going on by asking some of these questions and ensuring that rather than having to ask them every time, that they start to just become the cultural norm. So rather than just saying this is becoming an issue, it's truly dissecting down, and I won't get into the nitty-gritty of what's on the slide, but for everyone to understand what is the true impact. How critical is it now versus 6 months from now? What are the key steps we can take to start to address them, as opposed to things just kind of boiling beneath the surface? Or are there any lo-fi solutions that might actually suit the need? Like, rather than ensuring that a marketing team has a million bells and whistles for them to curate absolutely every possible segmentation strategy that they want, can we simplify temporarily just so that we continue to meet their need, but also not overburden the technical team burdened with having to sustain all of those systems? And then separately, is there anything we're forgetting about? Is there anything that as an entire organization we're not being privy to? And how can we ensure that tech debt is not accidentally piling up on something that we don't even realize? So again, if at any point you're going to enter a new market or focus on a new industry, or do something that is a little bit of a paradigm shift, rather than only thinking about the go-to-market implications of that, let's think about the technology aspects, and let's really ensure that everyone is on board to understand what the implications are. Next slide, please. Similarly, of course, the UX debt. This is far more obvious, it's far more palpable at times. And so again, to what degree is this impacting something? Which devices or markets or like entire journeys might suddenly experience hiccups? or vice versa. They might not experience the hiccups. They'll just attrition outright because they might not understand the value prop of what we're doing. Something might get lost in translation, whether it's visual representation, content, copy, and so on. And that's where you can truly leverage your customer support team, because they're the ones that are in the trenches. They get to hear those verbatims. They get to, unfortunately, experience some of that friction and those pain points that hopefully we can learn from ahead of time and not just once something has hindered the user experience. Next slide, please. So of course, everyone loves to say, let's just do X. It's the MVP, let's do it. But let's not forget about the following, following through. The follow-up of the MVP scope is this: how can we now gradually get to a point where we do continue to build momentum? And my biggest thing here is to build that buy-in and alignment so that it's not product building a political campaign and having to constantly be the one to resurface, but rather by ensuring the root cause and the true nature of the problem is obvious for everyone, it will start to just surface on its own. It should become the end goal as opposed to just one of the many things on the to-do list. So really and truly embodying user empathy and championing that across the board. Next slide, please. Basically the sentiment of everyone is part of the product team. Next slide. Yep, and lastly, as I touched on this a little bit already, so if we go on to the next slide, really ensuring that you can constantly be aware of what's going on out there. So if, again, I've touched on segmentation a lot for some reason today, but anytime there's a desire for the product to support all kinds of different strategies, whether it's a go-to-market rollout and having some combination of AI-fed elements versus a manual curated approach by a marketing team on a local market, for example, or anytime there's like new ideas coming to the fore, that you actually have systems in place. And I do say systems instead of just meetings and chat, so that each of these potentially conflicting forces at play do all come to fruition in a way that makes sense from a priority standpoint. Easier said than done. And I won't get into the nitty-gritty details because each organization is so wildly different that it's why we're employed. But essentially, if there are sudden pressures from legal or compliance, of course, that should by no means be an optional decision point. It should just be, this is the thing we absolutely need to do. How can we ensure that perhaps we create internal tooling so that we democratize the ability for this thing to be supported instead of it being dev tickets anytime anything needs to happen? Do we have the luxury of doing that and taking a quick step back to support the operational aspects of our organization in a better way than to just say, oh, sounds like there's going to be a bunch more work for that department? And of course, as I alluded to earlier, if business development, sales, et cetera, start to feel like there are several client needs, is there anything we can do to really understand the root cause of those needs and see if there's any convergence? Is there any form of Venn diagram overlap, especially at the architecture level? Are there things that the product team can do to support bringing all of those conversations together and say, it looks like the root cause is actually this, which will enable us to do this so that we can have some of the fancier UX or truly palpable aspects of the experience be well supported. As with anything, if you can't measure it, you can't change it. So there's going to be a degree of friction if there is no at least benchmark or goal that you can kind of strive towards and actually track. But oftentimes, depending on the nature of your organization, some of these pieces should start to come to the surface quite easily if everyone is sharing the same language across the board. And that, if anything, is maybe my last takeaway. If you can go into the final slide there. There's a lot of different paths for product management to help a team reach a goal. But if we go to the next slide, gradually getting all of us onto the same page rather than a disparate product roadmap, click please, a totally complex user experience and all of these triggers happening behind the scenes so that the user is not privy to any of that and they just see what they need when they need to see it and have the ability to take action on their own based on what they truly require. And I think we've got one more slide to go. Yeah, basically just as you know, a million different ways for us to work together, hopefully with everyone truly understanding product vision, what are we trying to achieve, and how can we all collectively support the user experience at the end of it all. That's it for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Pam. Really appreciate it.